Let's be honest, dealing with insurance, it can feel kind of like you're walking through a maze but blindfolded. And then on top of that, you hear about all this insurance fraud going on, and it just makes you think like, wait, so people are actually like profiting off this whole system, this system that I can barely even wrap my head around. Which is exactly why today we're doing a deep dive into the world of insurance fraud. We're going to be unpacking, how it all works, the different shapes and sizes it comes in, and ultimately what it means for, all of us.
Yeah. It really is a fascinating area. I think when you start to, peel back the layers, you see that's not always about greed, although greed certainly plays a part. Desperation loopholes in the system. A whole lot of psychology is tied into it all.
Okay,
And
so before we get into like all the specifics, can we just like break down the two main categories of insurance fraud, hard fraud and soft fraud? Because honestly, right now they kind of sound like ice cream flavors to me.
that's a good way to put it. Hard fraud is like the really calculated stuff. They, staged accidents, arson, even faking your own death. These are very intricate schemes with a very clear goal: to get a big payout.
Wait, hold on. Faking your own death, is that like a real thing? I mean, it sounds like something out of a movie.
It absolutely happens.
Yeah.
And it's often a lot more elaborate than you'd think. We're not just talking about like disappearing. We're talking creating a believable scenario,
Yeah.
sometimes involving multiple people.
Mm.
There was actually this one case where this guy convinced his family he'd fallen off a cliff while hiking, only to resurface years later living a new life.
Yeah.
With all that insurance money, of course, he ended up getting caught, but just goes to show the lengths people will go to.
Wow, that's wild. Okay, so if hard fraud is like the mastermind level stuff,
Yeah.
what makes soft fraud soft?
Soft fraud is definitely a lot trickier because it kind of lives in that gray area. It's less about outright lies and more about bending the truth, exaggerating claims, or conveniently forgetting key details just to get a little bit extra from the insurance company. It's the kind of thing a lot of people do without even really thinking of it as like real fraud. And that's what makes it even more widespread.
I think we've all been there,
Yeah.
Maybe rounding up the cost of repairs on a car insurance claim. Or conveniently forgetting to mention that like old crack in your windshield before filing a claim.
Precisely. And that's what makes soft fraud so interesting from like a psychological standpoint. A lot of people don't see it as harmful. They kind of justify it in their mind, like, oh, the insurance company has deep pockets, or they'll never miss this small amount. But the reality is when everybody takes that approach, it adds up to huge costs for the whole industry. And those costs ultimately get passed on to all the policyholders in the form of, you guessed it, higher premiums.
So it's kind of like a tragedy of the commons situation, where like each individual action on its own might seem insignificant, but collectively it creates this big problem.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for us to, understand the motivations behind soft fraud. It's not just about like catching the bad guys. It's also about shifting our collective mindset and, recognizing that even small acts of dishonesty can have these significant consequences.
Okay, so we've got our, ice cream flavors of fraud defined. Now let's dive into the wild world of hard fraud. Staged accidents, arson, even fake deaths. Where do we even begin?
Well, staged car accidents are a good place to start
Yeah.
because they often involve a whole cast of characters and like a carefully orchestrated plan. Imagine you're driving along, minding your own business, right? And all of a sudden, bam, somebody slams on their brakes in front of you for no reason. You rear end them. And suddenly multiple people are claiming whiplash and other injuries. It's really a dangerous game. You're putting innocent people at risk for this payout.
It's crazy to think that people would actually go to those lengths. What about arson, though? Like, what drives someone to intentionally set something on fire for insurance money?
Desperation plays a huge role in this. Imagine someone who's facing mounting debts, a failing business, the threat of foreclosure. They see that insurance payout as a way to escape their financial woes, a last-ditch effort to rebuild. Of course it's illegal and incredibly dangerous, not just for the person doing it, but for anyone else who might be nearby.
Yeah, it's definitely not a victimless crime. And then there's like the ultimate act of deception, faking your own death. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's worth exploring a little bit further, like what kind of person decides to stage their own demise?
It's kind of a complex mix of factors. Sometimes it's financial pressure, like we talked about with the hiker who wanted to start fresh with that insurance money. Other times, it's a desire to escape responsibility, maybe an unhappy marriage or a mountain of debt. There are even cases where it's like a twisted sense of adventure, a desire to just disappear and reinvent themselves.
It's fascinating and disturbing all at the same time. And while it's thankfully rare, we can't forget about the darkest form of hard fraud. Murder for insurance. Taking someone's life for a payout. It's truly chilling.
Absolutely. While greed is certainly a factor, it's often intertwined with desperation. A belief that this is the only way out of a desperate situation. These cases are just a stark reminder of the dark side of human nature.
Okay, so we've covered kind of the spectrum of hard fraud here, from staged accidents to the ultimate betrayal of murder. It's clear that it's not just about greed, but like this complex web of motivations. Now let's shift gears a little bit and delve into the more nuanced world of soft fraud. That gray area where the lines between right and wrong can get blurry.
It's an area where I think a lot of us can see ourselves reflected in those actions, even if we don't want to admit it. And that's what makes it so important to unpack. It's an area where I think a lot of us can see ourselves reflected in those actions, even if we don't want to admit it. And that's what makes it so important to unpack.
Yeah, we were just starting to get into soft fraud, that realm of like little white lies in the insurance world. It's so pervasive, and I think a lot of people struggle with like where to draw the line. I mean, we've all been tempted to inflate a claim a little bit, right?
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so tricky to combat. It's often rationalized as like no big deal because the target is this huge corporation and no one's really getting directly hurt.
But there is a cost, right? Even if it's not immediately obvious.
Exactly. Think about like all those little exaggerations on claims multiplied across millions of policyholders. Those insignificant amounts turn into a massive problem for the insurance industry. And those costs inevitably get passed down to all of us through higher premiums.
So even if I'm being completely honest, I could end up paying more because of the collective dishonesty of others. That doesn't seem very fair.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality. And it kind of creates this feedback loop where people see those rising premiums and feel even more justified in like fudging their own claims. They're thinking, well, I'm already paying an arm and a leg, so why not get back what I can?
It's like we're eroding the foundation of trust that the whole system is built on.
Precisely. And that's why it's crucial to understand like the psychology at play here. People often see insurance companies as these faceless entities, not individuals. They're directly harming. Plus, most of us have had like frustrating experiences with insurance, the paperwork, the denials, the feeling of being nickel and dimed.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that feeling of like fighting the system to get what you're rightfully owed.
Exactly. So when it comes time to file a claim, that resentment can kind of surface,
Yeah.
leading people to think, well, if they can play games with the rules, so can I.
It's almost like a form of self-sabotage. We're all part of this system, so when we cheat it, we're ultimately cheating ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about the financial costs either. There are ethical and social implications as well. When dishonesty becomes normalized, it erodes trust in all areas of life.
That's a sobering thought. Okay, so we've talked about like the general concepts of hard and soft fraud. Can we get a little more specific now and break down the different types of insurance fraud people should be aware of? Because it's not just car accidents and house fires, right?
Definitely not insurance fraud. It's kind of like a many-headed hydra. It pops up across all these different industries and takes countless forms.
So let's unpack some of these heads, starting with health insurance. What kind of like fraudulent schemes are we talking about here?
Well, think about the sheer volume of claims that are processed in healthcare every day. It's like a breeding ground for fraud. We see everything from individuals submitting fake claims for treatments or medications they never actually received to healthcare providers inflating bills or billing for services that were never rendered.
So on one hand, you have people trying to game the system for a quick buck, and on the other hand, you have these unethical providers taking advantage of the complexity of medical billing.
Exactly. And there's also upcoding, which is where a provider bills for a more expensive procedure than the one that was actually performed. It's a way to kind of exploit the system for greater profits.
Sounds like a real mess to untangle. What about auto insurance? We've talked about staged accidents, but are there other common scams out there?
Well, plenty exaggerated injury claims are a big one. Someone might like bump their car and claim severe whiplash or back pain, even if their injuries are really minor. And they might conveniently forget to mention any pre-existing conditions to make the injury seem more serious and costly.
So it's all about playing up the drama for a bigger payout. What about damage to the car itself? Any common scams there?
Absolutely, hiding pre-existing damage is a classic move.
Yeah.
Let's say you have like a fender bender that you never got around to fixing. A few months later, you get in another accident and try to claim that all the damage was from the more recent incident.
It's amazing how creative people can get when there's money on the line. What about homeowners insurance? What are some of the schemes we see there?
Well, faking a burglary is always popular. Someone might claim their house was broken into and all these valuables were stolen, but in reality, those items never even existed. Or they might like stage a break-in to make it look more convincing.
So they're essentially like producing their own little crime drama for the insurance company. And I imagine inflating the value of those stolen items is another tactic.
Definitely, that old scratched-up TV suddenly becomes a top-of-the-line model when it's time to file a claim.
Yeah.
It's all about maximizing that payout.
What about damage to the house itself? Any common scams there?
Oh, sure. Blaming old damage on recent events is a classic move. Let's say a hailstorm hits and causes some minor roof damage. You might seize that opportunity to claim that the storm also caused, like, a leak in your bathroom ceiling, even though that leak has been there for years.
It's like opportunistic dishonesty using a legitimate event to try to get coverage for unrelated problems.
Exactly. And let's not forget about life insurance, where the stakes can be even higher.
We've already touched on the extremes of faking death and murder for insurance, but are there other types of life insurance fraud people should be aware of?
Yeah, misrepresenting information on the application is a big one. People might lie about their age, health conditions, or risky hobbies like skydiving to secure a lower premium. They're essentially gambling that they won't die during the policy term, and the insurance company will never find out.
So it's a bet with potentially huge consequences. And what about fraud involving the beneficiaries of a life insurance policy?
That's another area where we see problems in beneficiary fraud can involve forging a will or pressuring a vulnerable person into changing their beneficiary designation. It's a way to kind of exploit the system after someone has passed away.
Wow, that's pretty heartless. Okay, and lastly, we have workers' compensation fraud. What are some of the common schemes we see in that arena?
Well, employees might fake or exaggerate injuries to receive benefits. They might claim they hurt their back lifting a box at work when they actually injured themselves playing basketball over the weekend.
So it's about taking advantage of the system that's meant to protect workers who are genuinely injured on the job.
Exactly. And we also see employers committing fraud to avoid paying their share. They might misclassify employees or underreport payroll to lower their workers' comp premiums.
It seems like fraud is a problem on both sides of the equation, employees and employers alike.
Unfortunately, that's true. And it just underscores the importance of understanding how these schemes work and what we can do to prevent them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, uncovering the many faces of insurance fraud. It's clear this is like a pervasive problem that impacts all of us, driving up costs and eroding trust in the system. But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to talk about solutions. What are insurance companies doing to combat fraud, and what can we as individuals do to protect ourselves and help prevent it?
That's a great question, and thankfully there's a lot happening on both fronts. The fight against fraud is evolving with technology and human expertise working hand in hand to protect the integrity of the system. That's a great question, and thankfully there's a lot happening on both fronts. The fight against fraud is evolving with technology and human expertise working hand in hand to protect the integrity of the system.
So it sounds like it's not just your old school detective work anymore, though. That still probably plays a role. You mentioned technology, so we're in the age of big data, sophisticated algorithms, all that.
That's true.
It's like they have their own version of crime fighting AI now.
Exactly. Insurance companies are leveraging technology in some really fascinating ways. Like these systems can analyze mountains of data, in real time, looking for patterns, red flags that might indicate fraud.
Can you give me an example? How would this work in practice?
Okay, so let's say someone files a claim for a stolen diamond necklace. The system can cross-reference that claim with their purchase history, their social media activity, even weather reports to verify their story. If there are inconsistencies or suspicious details, the claim gets flagged for further investigation.
So it sounds like it's getting a lot harder to pull the wool over their eyes these days.
It definitely is. And in addition to these, high-tech tools, insurance companies still have teams of investigators who specialize in uncovering fraud.
Yeah.
They're the ones who dig deep, interview witnesses, and use their expertise to build a case when something just seems fishy.
So it's like a combination of human intuition and cutting-edge tech working together. What about us, though, the everyday policyholders? What can WE do to protect ourselves from fraud and contribute to a healthier system?
I think the most important thing is honesty. Always be truthful and accurate when you're applying for insurance and filing claims.
So no matter how tempting it might be to fudge the details or inflate the cost of something, it's just not worth it in the long run.
Exactly. Those little white lies can have serious consequences, not to mention they contribute to that cycle of distrust and ultimately hurt everyone beyond honesty. Though it's also crucial to read and understand your policy, know what's covered, what's not, and what your responsibilities are. You'd be surprised how many people actually commit fraud simply because they didn't understand the terms of their agreement.
So it's not just about malicious intent, but also about being informed and proactive.
Absolutely. And if you ever witness something suspicious or you have reason to believe that fraud is occurring, report it. You can contact your insurance company or even law enforcement.
So I see my neighbor like staging a slip and fall on their icy driveway to try to get a payout. I shouldn't just like turn a blind eye.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Reporting suspicious activity helps protect the system, and it prevents honest policyholders from bearing the cost of fraudulent claims.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive into insurance fraud. It's been eye-opening. We've learned about the different forms it takes, the motivations behind it, and the steps being taken to combat it.
It's a constant battle, but one that's definitely worth fighting for. A fairer, more transparent system benefits everyone.
Absolutely. And we can all play a part by being honest, informed, and vigilant. Before we wrap up, though, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about those like gray areas of soft fraud where the lines can get a little blurry if it's so common and often goes unpunished. Is it really that wrong? Where do we draw the line between being savvy and being dishonest when it comes to dealing with insurance?
That's a great question to ponder. It reminds us that even within a large, complex system like this, our individual choices really do have an impact.
Well said. We encourage you to share your thoughts on this ethical dilemma with us on social media using the episode hashtag Remember. Deep Divers Knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay curious, and until next time, may your claims always be legitimate.